All right. Well, thank you, Shelby. Good morning again, everybody. My name is Jeremy Evans. I'm the principal consultant with Constant Consulting LLC. I live and work here in Troy, and I've worked with the Chamber on a couple of these presentations, and I'm happy to be back for today's session. I will mention that we are using Zoom. We are using this new virtual format, and I've told my kids to be quiet. I've got a sign on the door that says "Do not disturb." I don't have any pets in the house, so odds are we're not going to have any dramatic interruptions that are going to go viral or anything like that. So you won't see this featured on a TikTok video or being shared on any of the social media platforms of the pitfalls of Zoom. So hopefully things will go well. And as I said, I'm looking forward to our conversation today. So we're going to be talking about this idea of the new normal. And certainly the world that we're in today, we've got a lot of new and not a whole lot of normal. As far as new, we're obviously we're faced with a lot of new information every day. We get new statistics, new data, new guidelines, new regulations that we're faced with. And it doesn't quite feel normal yet. And so we're not quite sure exactly what that normal feeling is going to be like or when it's going to get to that point when we're actually going to start feeling it. And the closest thing that I can relate to, I was having this conversation yesterday. I was out at a store yesterday picking up some items, and I was talking to one of the managers there. And we were just, kind of describing, what it's been like to live in these times. And the closest analog that we could come up with and compare this to is, if you remember back, I guess it's been close to almost 20 years ago, but 19 years ago, in the days, the weeks, the months after 9/11. You have this significant historical event. And if you remember some of the changes that came about, especially related to travel and security around events, it was just, it took some time. It took some time for us to get used to having to take our shoes off as we go through the TSA line, or having to have our bags checked as we went into a stadium and things like that. And that's one of the things that I tell my kids is, hey, be aware of what you're going through. It's not just you have to take your classes online at school now, or that your sports have been canceled, but just be aware. Be aware of what this is like, because I guarantee this is something that you're going to be telling your kids and your grandkids about what it was like to live through the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, as I said, a lot of newness, and it doesn't quite feel normal yet. And certainly, there's nothing wrong with you if you don't quite feel normal. So, how are we going to cope with this? How are we going to deal with this, especially in our roles as entrepreneurs or as business owners or business leaders? And what's so important about leading through this period of time with these concepts of agility and emotional intelligence? Why now? Why is it especially important for us now? And that's one of the things that I'm going to spend some time talking about. I also want to talk about the idea of mindsets. So at the end of the session, we'll get into the everything DISC assessment. We'll get into Agile EQ and how you'll be able to participate in these assessments and get some information about yourselves and some of your own preferences. But we'll talk about the idea of mindsets and how to use the different mindsets in different situations. So whatever the situation calls for, understanding what you're most comfortable with and how you might be able to adapt or connect more effectively. And then I will give you a little bit of guidance about what to do from here. So as I said, I am going to introduce some concepts to you, but we are going to give you some instructions as far as how you can access your own assessment, how you can take that here in the next couple of weeks, and then schedule a debrief with me and go through that. So that's just a little bit of what we're going to talk about. We will have time, as Shelby mentioned, for questions. So we have discussion after I go through my slides. We'll certainly be able to do that. I know we're scheduled for an hour, but don't worry, we're not going to take up that full hour with just me talking. So let's get into it. Let's talk a little bit about this new world. And I do want to go through this slide real quick here. So if you were on my last session, I talked about the idea of change and transition. So I'm not going to go through that entire thing again, but this graphic that you're seeing is a representation of what I call the three-phase model of change and transition. And the idea is that as changes occur in our life or in our organizations, we go through different phases of dealing and adapting to those changes. And we move from the left to the right. So we always start with an ending, we go into this neutral zone area, and then we finally start feeling normal again, and we start feeling this new beginning phase. And for us, today, here on Wednesday, May the 13th, where we're at right now is kind of smack dab in the middle of this neutral zone area. So we're starting to see some things come to an end as far as the stay-at-home orders, the different regulations that have affected the operation of businesses, whatever business that might be. So we're starting to process and get through some of those endings, which is great because we're moving through change. However, where we end up is there in the middle with that neutral zone. And you can see some of the descriptors in that middle section: confusion, disorientation, impatience. And no doubt you can probably relate to feeling that way right now. And so as we think about this idea of the new normal, what we've faced with is you've probably heard the acronym VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That's the environment that we're facing today. And this acronym has actually been around for several years. And really what it speaks to is the challenges that all businesses, all institutions, and all organizations face. Is there's always going to be things in our environment, circumstances, whether that's new technology, or whether that's disruption by a competitor, whether that's government regulations, whether it's new marketplaces, new products. There's always going to be things that introduce these concepts into our worlds. And certainly COVID-19 is a great disruptor. So it's introduced certainly volatility because economically, we're not quite sure exactly what can be open, when the customers will come back, what that future holds for us. Uncertainty in terms of timing. So certainly we've had in Ohio, some pretty fairly clear guidelines as far as what the phases are going to be like, how things are going to reopen. But if we look at some of the other markets that we're dealing with, there's still some things that have yet to be resolved. A good example is with schools. We're not quite sure exactly what schools are going to look like in the fall, but that's something we really have to start planning for right now. And certainly complexity and ambiguity, those are also factors that we're dealing with. And once the COVID-19 pandemic reaches some level of stability, whether that's this year or next year or sometime in the future, we're still going to be faced with other disruptors. So getting comfortable with the uncomfortable is a skill that we should all learn to practice, and we should all learn to get into that mindset. Certainly today we've got heightened sensitivity. I was just talking about this with my wife earlier this morning as we were talking about some of our encounters, out in the retail environment, and everybody has this heightened sense of being on edge because we've been on lockdown, we've been in our homes in some cases for weeks, and so as we get out into the world and as we venture out, and we're able to open up our doors and see coworkers and see customers or see vendors, perhaps for the first time in a number of weeks. We're a little bit on edge. So we want what we want. We might be impatient, and everybody is almost looking for something to set them off. So we have to be aware of our own heightened sensitivities and the sensitivities of those around us. And what that's also going to create for us is a little bit of resistance. So we're not all comfortable with some of the things that we're faced with. And we'll talk about some of those specifics in a couple of slides. But as we're forced into new behaviors and as we're forced into circumstances that we're not comfortable with, we tend to resist that. We tend to demonstrate that in behaviors that may not always be pleasant. And certainly that can lead to the final bullet point that you see there, and that's conflict. And this is something that you'll see really in the news every single day, is conflict as the different states and as different areas start to open up. There's confusion as far as what we ought to do, what we have to do, what we have personal choice in, and if those opinions or if those thoughts don't agree amongst people or groups of people, we can see conflict arise. So how are we able to deal with that conflict constructively and hopefully peacefully? So that's part of our new normal. That's part of our environment that we're in right now. And the difficult part to say is we can't put some of these things onto a timeline, because of that uncertainty, because of not knowing what the risks are, what the dangers are. we can put certain opening dates on a timetable, but we're not sure exactly how long we're going to be in this situation. And that can be difficult. So depending upon how you're wired and what your own preferences are, you may be okay with that, or you may have a lot of difficulty with that. And if you're one of those people who are kind of okay, you're kind of go with the flow, I'm just going to stay above it, understand that other people might be more deeply affected. Other people really crave an amount of certainty. They have to know exactly what's going to happen and when. So having that ability to empathize a little bit and understanding that your comfort zone may not be the same as somebody else's is, again, a key skill that we want to think about. So I said we would talk about the idea of agility and emotional intelligence. And so I want to kick off with a little bit of a definitions around each one of those concepts. And no doubt you've heard the word agility before. And if you were to Google the word agility and look up the definition, this is a textbook definition, the ability to move quickly and easily. And I thought a good graphic of this would be, this is a game of football. And you can see people there in the crowds in the stands cheering it on. I know we've been without sports now for a couple of months, and I'm a huge sports nut. So I definitely miss the games and the action. But I thought this is a good representation of that ability to shift directions and that idea that you can move in one direction very quickly, but then just shift and move and go in a different direction very quickly. So that's agility. And it's easy to picture in an athletic competition somebody who's agile, but how can we be agile in a different environment? How can we be agile in our businesses? How can we be agile as people? And so part of this is understanding that we might be called upon in different situations to shift the way we've been doing things. And it can be hard if we're used to running our businesses or operating with our teams or leading in a certain manner that's always worked for us. Having that ability to shift gears and deal with new challenges might be a little uncomfortable. And so again, agility is one of those things that it's a skill that we can learn. It's a discipline that we can get better at, and certainly it is important in a time like this. So that's our definition of agility. And if we think about emotional intelligence, or you might have seen this abbreviated as EQ, emotional intelligence is the capacity to be aware of and control of and ability to express one's emotions. And I know some of you might start feeling some hairs rise up on the back of your necks as you start thinking about emotional intelligence, and you think, oh boy, we're getting into some touchy-feely stuff now. Well, that's if you've dealt with people in your organizations, you understand that people are emotional, people are rational, and we may not be wired that way. We may not prefer to deal with people that way, but it's important for us to keep that in mind. And something that research has shown us is that it is important. It is important for us to be both agile and emotionally intelligent when we're dealing with others in the workplace or in our organizations. And these statistics were actually developed from research that was conducted last year and the past couple of years. And you can see all of these numbers are in the 90s. So 90% of employees in the workplace say that agility is more important now than it was just 5 years ago. When it comes to leaders in businesses, 95% of managers say that agility is more important. We also see that 97% say emotional intelligence is important for that, for that agility to be developed. This is pre-COVID-19. So you can imagine when you have a disruptive influence like COVID-19, when we're dealing with all of that VUCA, that resistance, that potential for conflict, and those heightened sensitivities, that ability to be agile and the ability to be emotionally intelligent enough to deal with any situation becomes even more important. So, if not now, when is emotional intelligence ever helpful for us? Certainly is now. So as I said, the research bears that out. So when we start getting into, okay, I'm aware that I need to have some of these skills in my toolbox. What are some of the things that might come up that it's going to benefit me by having these capabilities? And just some questions for you to ponder. And no doubt you've probably already thought of these, or you've given these some consideration, but just some things for you to think about and perhaps discuss with or share with your employees or your leadership teams or peers in your organizations. we think about opening and we can say, okay, May 15th is when restaurants open, it's when different shops can open. What does open look like? In a very real logistical sense, what does open look like? Does it mean that, you know, you can have fewer people inside your place of business? Does it mean you've got to have physical separation between people in an office? Does it mean that you've got to have staging areas where people have to wait outside? Does it mean that you've got to be able to bring stuff out to people's cars? Do you have to be able to provide, PPE for people? What does open look like? What does your capacity to do business look like? And be very specific as you're planning for this, because it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to open up. It's another thing to actually get down to the details of doing that. The second question is no doubt one that is fraught with a lot of emotion, quite honestly, and that's the concept of wearing masks. And what I find kind of interesting is it's really become almost a politicized statement. So wearing a mask or not wearing a mask becomes more than just having a barrier on your face. It almost becomes a statement of where you might land on a set of political beliefs. And so we know that there are some regulations in place that affect using masks by people who work for a company or work in a business. But what does it mean for your customers? What does it mean for the visitors who come into your building? And how do you deal with that? And what's important for that is as you're developing your own policies or your own guidelines on how you and your workers are going to engage with masks, is thinking about making sure that there's a story there, because you can run into customers who might be very, very vociferous in their opinions to say, yes, I want to wear a mask and here's why, or no, I'm not going to wear a mask and here's why. And it's important for you and your employees to have a story to be able to tell. Because I guarantee you're going to see both sides of that continuum. You're going to hear extremes on either side of that spectrum. And again, this is something you've seen, unfortunately, in the news, where we've actually seen violence as a result of mask policies. So definitely something to consider and think about is what are the implications of masks in my business and in my organization? Thinking about how busy you're going to be. What are your forecasts like from now till the end of the year? Now that the doors will be opening, or do you expect to see the same kind of volume? How are you going to be able to accommodate, and how might you be able to pursue new markets if that stream of customers isn't what it had been planned for at the beginning of the year? Is the physical threat contained? When we start seeing disruptions to our lives, we start thinking back to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Remember that pyramid of having basic human needs met. And that concept of safety and security is very important for people. So how are we meeting basic needs? And is the physical threat contained? Is the physical threat only the threat of a virus, or is the physical threat not having enough money to pay for groceries? And so you've got to be able to consider all those questions, whether it's from customers, whether it's from coworkers, whether it's from the staff that you're supporting. And what are you doing in order to support that staff? Again, how are you engaging with them? What is the message that I'm communicating to customers? One of the things that we understand when it comes to change is we need to over communicate. We need to be able to communicate as many different means as possible, to whatever stakeholders we're dealing with. And then finally, the last one there is, how long is this going to last? How long will some of these regulations be in place? And that's where it becomes difficult, because right now there's not really a clear answer for that. And so just, some things to keep in mind, and things, if you haven't considered all of these things yet, certainly, put those into your hopper as far as the things that you're thinking about as you move into the future with the state opening back up. All right, so I want to shift gears now and talk about this idea of mindsets. And so I mentioned the concept of agility, concept of emotional intelligence. Now introduce the concept of mindsets. And what I've got here shown is a tool that I've used with a number of clients called Everything Disc and the Agile Mindsets. And what this shows is you can see in that diagram, I've got a basic disc globe or a disc sphere, and it's got the 4 different disc styles. And if you're not familiar with disc, if you're not familiar with that assessment, really it's a tool that's used to determine some of an individual's behavioral, personality, preferences. And so if we overlay the idea of agility and emotional intelligence on that, we get this concept of mindsets. And all of us have specific mindsets that we're more drawn to. And so I like to call these a comfort zone. And your comfort zone is kind of it's your happy place. It's where you spend most of your time. It's the mindset that's most easily accessible for you. It's where it's how you tend to react to most situations. It's your default setting. And as you can see, from the ones that are shown on this slide, there's a number of different ones available. So you might be more closely identified with self-assured up there in that top left-hand corner. So asserting your opinions and rights, projecting confidence, kind of that idea of being very bold and being very assured in your actions and driving towards results and driving towards specific outcomes, being in charge. Or you might gravitate towards perhaps being a little bit more skeptical, wanting more and more information, questioning the source of data, wanting some time to to analyze and break things apart, keeping emotion out of the equation. Or you might simply be on another side of that spectrum and saying, I'm going to be more empathetic. I'm going to be more sensitive to the needs of people versus things and concepts. So your mindset could be any one of these. It could be any one of these 8. And there's ones that you're more drawn to, and there's others that you're simply not going to be comfortable with. And so the idea behind the agility and the EQ model is that you have to understand what your own strengths and preferences are, and then you have to be able to say, okay, what does the situation call for? Because you can't use one single tool to deal with every situation. So understanding what your own strengths are, understanding what your own tendencies tend to be, and then saying, how can I use that to my advantage, or how can I maybe draw that back a little bit if the situation doesn't call for it. And the one question that I will get anytime that I talk about this is, okay, I see some mindsets and I see that there's a number of them that are available to me. Which one is best? And because what a person is usually looking for when they ask this question is they're looking for some validation that whatever mindset they're most comfortable with, they're looking for some reassurance that, yes, you're right, yours is the best. And what I'll say is every mindset is useful. So it really depends upon the situation. And this is where we see agility and emotional intelligence really come into practice, is being able to diagnose and understand what the situation calls for. Because if we think about, that idea of that very confident, very bold, very self-assured mindset, it may not be the appropriate one to use in a particular context. Other times it might be. You might have to be very resolute and very firm and very direct in your approach, but not always. And so you're understanding what the situation calls for and then being able to flex into or lean into the appropriate one is really the significance. That's really the idea that you're growing, that you're learning, and that you're able to match what the situation calls for. And that's part of adapting and connecting. So understanding what we need. And the difficult part is that it does take some deliberate energy. It takes things like being able to step back from the situation. It takes a little bit of time, avoiding an automatic reaction. So a lot of times if we're faced with a situation, whether that's dealing with a customer, it's negotiating some terms on a contract or an agreement, it's handling a management situation where you're dealing with an employee, avoiding an automatic reaction, understanding exactly what the facts are, understanding what the stakes are, what the possible options and outcomes might be, and then putting all that through and then not necessarily going with your first or your automatic reaction, but actually taking some time, deliberating on it and understanding, what the best path forward is. And again, it might be a stretch. It might be a little bit of a step into the uncomfort or the discomfort, something that you're not used to practicing. And that last word there is what it takes. It does take practice. So understanding that people are different, understanding people are wired differently, and being able to take some conscious effort to say, I'm going to practice using a mindset that I'm not normally comfortable with. And the more you're able to do that, the more agile you become. So it's almost like an exercise regimen. It's like a workout program, and saying, hey, I know I have this natural strength, but I want to get better at some of these other mindsets. And certainly this is what your profile would look like. So an example of what it might look like. So somebody who's very strong in that receptive mindset, you can see what their map might look like. And your particular profiles are going to look a little bit different. So as I said, you'll all have a chance to get your own, and I'll give you some instructions on how to get that. But what this document does, it's a 25 or 26 page report, but it will show you, where your strengths lie. So when it comes to agility, when it comes to emotional intelligence, it'll either surprise you or might confirm some assumptions or beliefs you might already have about yourself. But it'll illuminate for you and let you know, hey, here's where you're strong. Here's where you have some natural tendencies when it comes to your emotional intelligence. Here are some areas where you might need to stretch into, or you might need to grow into. And so what it does is it illuminates that comfort zone for you, but it also helps unlock your potential for those other areas. And what's nice about this document, as I said, it's very lengthy, and it gives you specific strategies. So for this person whose strength is in that receptive quadrant, they might need to grow into resolute or self-assured or dynamic. And the profile actually gives them specific strategies and specific activities to help them grow into that. And that's part of what you'll get with your profiles. So where do we go from here? Where do we look at from this point? So really, personal growth comes from discovering, recognizing, and then acting. And so as far as the discovery piece, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send out an email message to all of you that will have a little access code. It'll have a link in it and an access code so that you can access your own personalized online Agile EQ assessment. And so it only takes about 15 or 20 minutes to take that online assessment, and then I'll get the results, and then I'll contact you and schedule some time with you for a debrief for that profile. There's no charge for this profile. Normally it's $120, but as part of this chamber outreach event, we're offering those to you at no charge. I will say there is a time limit on them, so you will need to make sure that you take that assessment by May 27th. So that's the discovery piece. So get some information about yourself. So from there, you've got to be able to recognize. You want to be able to recognize. And this is where you want to look for mindset indicators of those that you're engaging with. So understanding, again, what a situation might call for, and then looking for indicators of how other people are behaving. Now, the bad news here is that people don't go around with their profiles, with their 26-page printout, and say, here you go, here's the best way to communicate with me, or here's how I like to behave. So you've got to be able to pick up on cues. You've got to be able to look for verbal and nonverbal indicators of what a person's preferences or styles might be. But once you get better at doing that, then you can move to that third step, which is practicing, and actually practicing some agility, whether that's with customers, it's coworkers, it's peers, vendors, whoever it is that you're dealing with, you'll have a chance to put those skills into practice. And yes, you can include family members in that as well. So my wife can always tell when I'm trying to practice some of my EQ skills, and she says, "Don't try that EQ stuff with me. I'm your wife." And I said, "Well, honey, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to get better professionally." But really, any people that you engage with, you'll have an opportunity, because no two people are wired the same. All right, so that's everything that I wanted to cover with this session. And so really, this is just an overview of what the Agile EQ concept does for you. As I said, I will be emailing out those links to everybody, so look for yours. It'll have that individual code. Take that assessment sometime between now and 2 weeks from now, and then once I have the results, I'll be reaching back to you to schedule a debrief. So at this point, what I'd like to do is to see if Shelby has any questions that have come in through the chat, or if we can use the raise hands feature to ask questions while we have people on the phone.